Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the June installment of the Renewable Energy Working Group webinar series for the Wildlife Society. Thank you all for joining us. These webinars have really been very informative, and we're getting really great response from membership for hosting these every month. And this month, we're really excited to have Lee Walston, who is a landscape ecologist at Argonne National Laboratory, where he has over 15 years of experience evaluating the ecological impacts and opportunities of energy developments. His work combines theoretical and applied approaches to informing renewable energy decisions and identifying energy ecological synergies. His projects often involve the development of new wildlife monitoring approaches, geospatial modeling, and ecosystem service valuation and assessment. He's been a member of TWS throughout his career and has served on the Renewable Energy Working Group for the past 5 years. He's actually one of our board members at large right now, and he's been a great asset to the Renewable Energy Working Group over the last couple years. So Lee, with that, I will allow you to introduce your topic and go from there. If you have any questions, folks, feel free to post them in the chat box. We will ask those at the end. We also welcome you all to just introduce yourselves in the chat box, because we do keep notes of who attends these and hopefully can continue to reach out to you guys if you're a member of the working group. So Lee, with that, I will turn it over to you.
Perfect. Yeah, thank you, Susan. Well, it's great to be here, everybody. Good afternoon, and it's kind of appropriate that we're talking about pollinators, considering it is Pollinator Week. This is the week where we're sort of recognizing the value of pollinators and what they provide to our communities, and to not just for biodiversity's sake, but also for the important roles that they play in our livelihoods. So it was sort of coincidental that this talk happens to coincide with Pollinator Week, but glad to be here, and glad it worked out in that sense that it all coincided. So hope everybody had a good solstice day as well. I know the pollinators appreciate that extra little bit of sunlight. And so what I'm going to do today is share with you a project that we've been working on for a number of years for the U.S. Department of Energy's Solar Energies Technologies Office, to look at the value and the opportunities of solar pollinator habitat at solar facilities. So the planting of pollinator-friendly vegetation at solar energy facilities, and what that can mean for biodiversity. And so this is a project, actually, I'm going to be sharing with you some preliminary results from a couple of projects. Most of the results and most of the data I'm going to be sharing come from one project in which we've been working with the National Renewable Energy Laboratory, NREL, for DOE. A couple of collaborators mentioned here, some folks at Argonne that I've been working with, Heidi Hartman and Laura Fox, as well as collaborators at NREL, Jordan Macknick and James McCall. And like Susan mentioned, feel free to type in the chat if you have any questions. I'd be happy to address any questions, anything that you might have towards the end of the talk. So let's talk about solar. So the future is solar. All projections that we have indicate that we're going to see a lot more solar on the landscape going forward. In a recent DOE publication that was just published late last year, I think September of last year, there was a lot of projections of future solar development to meet our decarbonization goals. And in those projections, it was estimated that we would need a lot more solar on the landscape, especially a lot more utility scale solar. So ground mounted utility scale solar, where the panels are feeding into the grid. Typically, we're talking about projects that are 1 megawatt or larger in size. And in those projections, we're looking at over 1,300 gigawatts of grid connected solar by 2050, again, to meet those decarbonization, net zero goals by 2050. And this is all published in the DOE Solar Futures Study, which came out last year. And just to kind of give you some context, we currently have about 80 gigawatts or so of ground mounted solar, maybe a little bit more, depends on who's counting. So roughly about somewhere between 80 and 100 gigawatts of ground mounted utility scale solar in the country. So we're talking about over 15 times more solar, again, ground mounted utility scale solar, over 15 times more on the landscape in the next 30 or so years in order to meet these goals. That's a lot of solar. And so you can kind of see here in the graph that we translate, this amount of solar development from megawatts into a footprint, because one of the challenges for solar development is it often occupies a large footprint, right? And so in order to develop 1,300 gigawatts of solar, so over a terawatt of solar, we're going to need over 10 million acres. That sounds like a lot, but it's really less than 1% of all of America, and it's still a fraction of the amount of available disturbed lands that are available, especially if you count all the agricultural fields that are out there, all the brown fields, and some of the other disturbed lands that are out there. It's still a fraction of all of that land as well, but still 10 million acres is 10 million acres. And so that's the challenge that we're facing, is how do we meet these clean energy goals in an environmentally sustainable way, looking at a future projection of 10 million acres or so. One of the answers for that is through agrivoltaics. So co-locating solar with other kinds of land uses that could benefit agriculture. The Department of Energy defines agrivoltaics as the co-location of solar and some of these types of designs that include obviously agricultural development, so row crop agriculture, livestock grazing, other types of animal husbandry, maybe beekeeping at these sites. Agrivoltaics could also include the co-location of solar and biodiversity. So this is where pollinator habitat comes into play. So co-locating solar facilities with pollinator-friendly vegetation, which could benefit biodiversity and could also provide other ecosystem services. Because with the deeper root systems that a lot of these native vegetation have, especially compared to turf grass, they could provide other types of ecosystem services with regards to soil carbon storage and sequestration, water conservation and soil quality, and preventing erosion. So there's a whole suite of ecosystem services that could come into play through the establishment of solar pollinator habitat. So the world of agrivoltaics, there are various definitions, but for the purposes of this talk and for DOE's definition, it could include any of these types of categories: co-locating solar with crop production, livestock grazing, habitat enhancement, or other forms of animal husbandry like beekeeping, et cetera. And so there's a lot of potential here to improve the environmental compatibility of solar in these areas, especially if they are properly sited, meaning that they are going into places that are already disturbed or developed to some degree. Maybe it's marginal farmland, maybe it's another disturbed site. So we advocate first and foremost that we are siting solar projects in areas where there's already been some form of disturbance, and we're not taking away prime farmland, for example, or previously undisturbed lands. And so we've already done a little bit of work in this space to sort of quantify the potential of certain types of agrivoltaic designs. And from here on out, I'm going to cover solar pollinator habitat. Maybe in the discussion, we can talk about some of the other aspects of agrivoltaics, but the purposes of this talk is on, solar pollinator habitat. And so we've already done a little bit of work sort of quantifying the potential opportunities for solar pollinator habitat, looking at the potential impacts or benefits to nearby adjacent agricultural land. So agricultural fields that might be pollinator dependent that could also benefit from solar pollinator habitat development in the vicinity. And so in one publication, we highlighted over 3,500 square kilometers of agricultural land that was adjacent to or near solar facilities that could benefit from the increase in pollinator communities as a result of solar pollinator habitat establishment at solar sites. In another study, we modeled and quantified the potential ecosystem services of solar pollinator habitat in terms of increased biodiversity, stormwater and erosion control, soil quality and carbon storage, and we modeled those and presented those in another publication, all looking at the using models and theoretical data to sort of quantify again the potential for this opportunity. But so far, there hasn't been much direct field evidence on the benefits of solar pollinator habitat. And so that's what I want to share with you today, some preliminary results on some work that we've done to look at the pollinator responses. If you build it, will they come? That's the title of the talk. You know, if you build the solar pollinator habitat or establish it, do you see increases in at least the insect pollinator communities as a result? So we've been doing some field work at solar sites that have been planted with solar pollinator habitat. And we've been conducting field work for a number of years, and I'm going to share with you some preliminary results. Emphasis on the preliminary because we're still crunching numbers and doing some data analysis, and field work is still going on even as I speak. In fact, next week I'll be out in the field doing this all again. So let me share with you a little bit about some of our field designs. So most of the work that we're doing is in the Midwest. So everything I'm going to be sharing with you today is sort of geographically focused in the Midwest. There's a lot of solar in the Midwest. I should have a slide. I'll make a note to when I do this presentation again, I'll have a slide that kind of shows the amount of solar in the Midwest. There's actually a lot of solar in the Midwest. Minnesota, in fact, leads the Midwest in terms of solar energy development. There's a lot of solar, in fact, in Minnesota. Other states like Indiana and Illinois and Wisconsin are catching up. There's a lot more solar in the pipeline, in the works for those states. And a lot of that solar is going into, as you might expect, former agricultural fields. So formerly, former row crop agriculture that was once corn, soybeans, and those kinds of things. So there are two related ongoing DOE projects that are going on right now. One is the Inspire project that is led by NREL. Argonne is partnering on that. And the other one is called PHASE, stands for Pollinator Habitat Aligned with Solar Energy. I think that's what it stands for. That one is led by the University of Illinois, Chicago. Argonne is also partnering on that one as well. And the two similarities in these two projects, they both have some similarities and differences, but the two similarities is that they're looking at pollinator habitat establishment and insect pollinator community responses at these solar facilities. So combined, there are 9 solar sites that are being investigated through these two projects in the Midwest. And those solar sites range anywhere between 3 megawatts all the way up to 200 megawatts. So a pretty big range. But for the purposes of this talk, we only have results from Minnesota currently available because that's the one state where we've been doing this the longest through the Inspire project. Through the PHASE project, we have been monitoring these other sites, but we only have less than a year's worth of data on those sites, so not really a whole bunch to really say yet. But we have 4 years of data to kind of look at, play with, and share from Minnesota. So that's kind of where I'm going to go from here on out. And so, so as the slide says, we've got 3 sites in Minnesota, ranging between 3 and 5 megawatts each, so roughly somewhere between 30 and 40 acres each site. So they're decent sites, but they're not your massive, really huge multi-thousand acre sites that you might have seen in the desert Southwest, for example. But they're, anywhere between 30 to 40 acres. They were constructed in 2017, and they were planted with pollinator-friendly seed mixes in 2018. I can go into more details about those seed mixes a little bit later, but they have a variety of seed mixes, I guess you can say. All of them were planted with some type of native seed mix, and some of them were planted with a variety of seed mixes in a sort of an experimental fashion to see which types of seed mixes work better. But all of them were planted with a native variety seed mix consisting of grasses, native forbs, native wildflowers, etc. Monitoring began in 2018, so I'll talk about that here in a little bit. We went out in the field and started monitoring these sites in 2018, pretty much right when they were planted. So 2018 is basically year 0 in this case, because it's right when the seeds were planted and the seeds were dropped. And so we started kind of at that baseline, and then we kept monitoring each year thereafter to kind of see trends. Here's a quick slide snapshot of some of the 3 sites. I know you can't really zoom in on these aerial satellite imagery snapshots very well, but I wanted to show this to you, just kind of give you an idea of where we're at. We're kind of surrounding the Minneapolis area. One site is pretty close to Minneapolis. 2 sites are a little bit further away. One is closer to Mankato, if you know Minnesota very well. And these images here kind of capture the real world aspects of these solar sites. These are real world solar sites. And so, they have a varying degree of different types of landscape context. They're all in agricultural settings, and they were all formerly row crop agriculture. So they have that in common. They were all formerly, row crop agriculture, but you can see this one here, it's close. It's close-ish to the edge of a city. So the town is right here on the western side of the solar facility, and then all this is ag land. This solar facility here, most of it is, ag land surrounding it, but you've got like a little natural area, like a forested area on the western side of it, sort of a natural pristine, area that's not developed. We can say it's not developed. It's sort of a forested area. And then over here, this is another solar site that's definitely in an agricultural landscape. All of these areas surrounding this are agricultural fields. But one unique thing here is that you've got a riparian area. There's a river that is not too far away. It's about 2 agricultural fields away. And so, just to kind of give you an idea that, of the different types of differing degrees of, landscape context that we're dealing with here, because these are real world solar sites. And we're trying to keep that into consideration when we're collecting the data and doing these analyses, which is one reason why we're focusing on this temporal approach. So looking at each solar facility over time, and seeing how, trying to detect changes over time from year 0, which again, in this case is 2018. So we came into this with a couple big questions. One was, do we see differences in the numbers and types of pollinators over time with the establishment of pollinator habitat? And also, secondly, do we see like a spillover effect? Do we see pollinators actually moving over into some of these offsite agricultural areas and see increases in their visitation to some of these nearby ag fields? So the main way that we're trying to accomplish this is through field work and surveys. So doing pollinator surveys along transects, following the Xerces Society's streamlined bee monitoring protocol. So Xerces Society has a protocol. I think it's 2014 is when it was published, but it's all geared towards streamlined efforts to quantify and observe pollinators along transects. Our transects are 100 feet long, and we set them up all throughout all the solar facilities and in adjacent agricultural fields where landowners have given us permission to monitor pollinators, and we're walking those transects at least 4 times per year during the peak flowering season. So in Minnesota, we've identified pretty much the month of July as the peak month of getting out there and observing pollinators, when we have the greatest chance of finding things in bloom. When the soybeans are in bloom, that's the dominant crop type that is surrounding a lot of these fields, soybeans. So when the soybeans are in bloom, when you have a good chance of finding the majority of the plants on site that are in bloom as well. So we've pretty much structured our design to go to these sites spanning from late June all the way through July and into the first half of August. And we'll go at least four times to each one of those sites over that span, averaging, every other week or so going to these sites. So we're not able to survey every week. We would like to do that, but we're not able to, our design was not allowing us to be present at all these sites every week, but instead we've gone every other week. Again, walking these transects, and I can show you a little bit more about what these transects look like. So here's one example, as a solar site with several transects on site, several transects off site. Here's an example photo of what one of them looks like on site. It looks just like you're looking down a row of panels, right? A row of solar panels. But we've flagged them off. I don't know if you can see, but there are 2 little pink flags here that sort of mark off the beginning of the transect, and then way off in the distance, 100 feet away, are more flags that mark off the end of the transect. And we just walk them in a timed interval. So according to the survey protocol, we are walking these transects at a pace that allows us to complete the transect in about 5 to 7 minutes. So for a lot of transects that have hardly anything in them, we're not seeing anything, it's a very slow pace. If all you're doing is walking, it's a very slow pace. Oftentimes, however, we do see a lot of insects, a lot of things in the transect. And so we have to, kind of keep our pace in line with that 5 to 7 minute interval as we're walking through. But as we're walking, we're taking note of every single insect that we see. And as you can imagine trying to fit these transect observations into a 5 to 7 minute window. We're not able to identify everything all the way down to species. What we're doing instead is we are identifying everything at least down to order and family, and where possible, if the insects cooperate and they sit still, we'll take photos of them and then upload them to various apps or tools to identify them later. But it's pretty straightforward to identify, at least to order and family, to understand if you're looking at a bee versus a fly versus a moth versus a butterfly, those kinds of things. And so yeah, here's a little bit more information about our field methods over the course of 4 years. We visited these sites, 4 times per year during the peak flowering season. Really in the month of July is what we're targeting. Transects 100 feet long, timed for 5 to 7 minutes. We're also in these transects counting the plant species and the dominant flowering plants as we are encountering them, so that we can quantify that later to again see if there are relationships in the number of insects with the number of open flowered plants, the dominant plant species. Here are the general categories of insects that we are identifying. If we can get to species or at least to genus, we will. So if we see a monarch butterfly, by golly, we're going to identify that as a monarch butterfly, those kinds of things. But, bumblebees, there are several different species of bumblebees. There are many different species of native bees, furrow bees, etc. It's just not possible, nor is that in part of our approach to identify all of those down to species. Instead, we're just kind of identifying them down to the lowest level that we can, which is usually family. So you can kind of get a sense here for the common types of categories that we're seeing. We have seen, well, as this image proves, we have seen several monarch butterflies in the field, lots of different types of bumblebees and native bees as well that we can get into. Okay, so as we're moving along, there are, we're trying to establish trends, or at least see if there are any trends in the data over time, because we've been doing this for 4 years. We've got 4 years of data out here in Minnesota. There are some days where our environmental standards have not been met. So we try to survey when field conditions are optimal, right? So days when it's a thunderstorm, or if it's rainy, or if it's really windy, or if it's cold. Sometimes when we start in the mornings, it's Minnesota, and so those mornings might not be warm enough to kind of meet those protocol standards. So in those cases, we have flagged and we've removed some observations from our data if they don't meet these standards. So if it's very cold, and there have been mornings even in July where it's been in the 50s when we started and things like that. So and then sometimes, because these are real world solar sites, it's hard to coordinate our monitoring activities with some of the site operation staff. And there've been a couple of times where we've gone to some of these sites and have found out that some of our transects were recently mowed. And so in those cases, if they were recently mowed, we've removed those from our data set for that time period. And so with that, we've got about, almost 400 total observations. About a quarter of them were removed because they, did not meet these standards. So with that, let's look at some preliminary results. We've got, plenty of time. So over time, as we have expected, we saw big changes in on-site plant diversity, going from when things were planted in 2018 to the last month when we have data, which is last July. We've seen some big changes. When we first started monitoring in 2018, there actually was vegetation on the ground. Most of it was different forms of grasses, barnyard grass, foxtail, some brome. It was heavily dominated by grasses, but we saw noticeable changes just in that first year, going from 2018 to 2019. And so, we've seen that, species diversity of flowering plants across all transects, on average, has increased about 4 times since 2018. And we're seeing year over year increases in the total number of flowering plant species that have been observed on these transects. And here's what one of the sites looks like today. Pretty good. This is one of them. And some of the common or the usual native plants that we are seeing at these sites, again, this is all region specific. So for Minnesota on sandier soils, these are the types of native vegetation that we would expect to see. Lots of black-eyed Susan in the first few years, golden Alexander, goldenrod, penstemon, common yarrow, bee balm, bergamot. There are some milkweed plants out there, prairie clover, and partridge pea. So those are the usual suspects on what we would have expected and have come to see, many of which are in this image here at some of these Minnesota solar sites. So that's good. This is what we're seeing, not across all the sites, but at every site. There's something like this at every site. There's also something like this at every site, where for whatever reason, there are just some rows, some segments of the solar site that have not been well established with the pollinator friendly seed mix. We don't really quite know why yet. It could be due to soils, just could be due to the seeds just didn't establish very well in these rows. But in these areas, we're seeing, we're still seeing some invasives or undesirables, I guess you could say. Canada thistle being one of them, ragweed, barnyard grass, foxtail, just a variety of grasses. And so even though these rows don't look as pretty, they're not as aesthetically pleasing, we were surprised to find that we're still seeing when we walk transects that are in these areas, and you can see there are flags in here. So this is a transect. We often see a lot of insect pollinators in these transects, and I don't know if it's they're visiting these plants, but what I'll show you here in a minute is these sites, these rows here are often very close to rows that are just like this. So just a few rows over, we could have transects and rows that look like this. So a lot of these solar sites have a variety of different types of plant establishment. And so I think, we're seeing in rows that are like this, we're still seeing a lot of insects, not quite as many as we're seeing in some of the other transects that have a high diversity of plants. But we're still seeing pollinators in these transects, even though they, might be, they might have a lot of thistle in them, or they might have a lot of ragweed. Those plants just, they also attract pollinators, maybe not as good as some of the native plants that we like, but we're still seeing a higher, high number of insects in those rows as well. But something like this and that other slide that I showed you are really the more desirable outcomes that we were wanting to see when we first set out on this and planted these plants. And so, but I just kind of wanted to give you an idea that, not every single row is producing results that looks like this. There are, some cases where, for whatever reason, whether it's soils or too much water or the seeds just didn't establish well, there's variation across the site. Okay, so let's look at the pollinator. So over the years, from 18 to 21, we did see increases in pollinator diversity over time. In the first couple of years, everything seemed to be pretty dominated by these very small hoverflies. But then even in 2019, just 1 year later, we started seeing a whole lot more in terms of beetles, butterflies, moths. And then in 2020, so the last 2 years, that's when we really started seeing increases in bees, a lot more bees becoming present. So bees are kind of like the blue and the light blue bars here. We might have seen like 1 or 2 bees total in 2018. We saw a few in 2019, you can see, but it wasn't until 2020 and obviously 2021 when we really started seeing bees in a lot of our transects. So the number of bees really started up, ticking up. And last year we saw a pretty wide variety of all types of insects. And last year there were a lot of beetles, right? And so there must have been a big boom in soldier beetles last year, because we just saw a whole bunch of soldier beetles in all of our transects. Okay, if we were to look at things graphically and trying to get some idea of statistical significance, I'm not going to share any statistical results because we're still crunching numbers, and so, but maybe we can see these graphs and kind of get an idea of, maybe some sort of future statistical significance. But this graph, if you were to look at all the average of all total pollinators across all years, there was over 20 times increase in pollinators observed since 2018. So a pretty big jump once we started getting to 2020. And then obviously last year, there were just a whole bunch of pollinators observed last year. Last year was a pretty good year, despite it being a drought. It was a pretty dry year in Minnesota last year, but we still saw quite a bit. Here are a couple images of some of the native bees on some of the wildflower plants around those solar sites. If we were to just look at bees, okay, so now not just looking at all pollinators, but just looking at bees, we're kind of seeing a similar trend that things really jump up in 2020. So like I said, if I, going back to that previous slide that showed the pie charts, 2020 is when we really started seeing a lot more bees, and that's reflected here in this graph as well. Four times increase in bees observed from 2018 to 2021. Let's see what else. Oh, and then we also kind of did this same transect-based survey design in the adjacent ag fields. And so I don't know if you can see this or not. Okay, yeah. So right next to one of our solar sites is this soybean field, and we noticed several times, this is just one example, of bumblebees visiting some of the soybean flowers just immediately adjacent to the solar site. So we kind of carried out this design, transect-based design in the soybean fields, and and set up these transects in different types of treatment groups. So some transects were in these solar adjacent soybean fields. Some of these transects were in roadside adjacent, so just about 1 kilometer away from the solar site, but just adjacent to a road, so a roadside ag field or roadside transect. And then some of these transects were also in CRP adjacent. So there's some CRP fields out there, and we set up these transects just right adjacent to those CRP fields, just to kind of get an idea of how do observations at solar adjacent crop fields compare to observations at roadside transects and CRP adjacent transects. And you can see in the graph here that in our solar adjacent transects, we're seeing way more bees. And so this is just looking at bees. So this graph is just looking at bees. We saw way more bees in the solar adjacent transects than we did at the roadside or the reference CRP adjacent ag fields. Whether or not there's statistical significance here, I'm not sure about the CRP. Looks like there could be some, with relationship to the reference roadside adjacent ones. But at least we're carrying out this study again this year to collect more data on this. So hopefully this year's data will help shed a little bit more light on this. But it's kind of an indication of where things are going, where things are heading with our observations. We're seeing more bees visiting soybean plants adjacent to solar sites than either any of these two reference transects. So that's a very quick snapshot of the work that we've done and some of the results that we've obtained over the last few years. Things are pointing in that direction, that if you do plant an established solar pollinator habitat, you do see changes over time in the insect pollinator community. Some next steps, we are currently running some of the statistical analyses that we plan to publish later on this year. Like I said, this work is ongoing. And so we will be collecting data this year and for the next 2 years. So, in the next few years, we should have, at least 5 or 6 years of data to kind of say, how the establishment of solar pollinator habitat influences community responses and insect communities. Let's see. And then we're also adding this year, some field work to conduct bird and bat monitoring at some of these solar sites to kind of extend our observations and our research to beyond insects, but to include other wildlife. So hopefully throughout all these studies in the next few years, we'll be able to answer some questions about, what seed mixes established successfully and perform the best, to what extent, of seeding is needed to achieve these pollinator outcomes. So do you need to plant these seed mixes across the entire solar site, or is it something to where maybe just buffers around the entire solar site site can be planted, those kinds of things. So we do have some solar sites that are part of this 9 solar site study that are investigating these different types of solar or these different types of pollinator planting designs. And then finally, we hope that this research will help shed some light on pollinator responses and if they vary by region. We certainly expect that they will, simply because pollinator communities vary by region and plant varieties and et cetera vary by region. But at least for the Midwest, we hope to be able to get a really good grasp on how effective solar pollinator habitat is to establish and what outcomes we can expect from that in terms of pollinator community responses. Real quick before I wrap up here, I just kind of want to share a few examples of some of the work that we're currently doing to monitor wildlife at solar facilities. So we're using acoustic recorders and wildlife cameras, motion triggered wildlife cameras at some of these solar sites to monitor, again, avian responses, bat responses, and the utilization and occurrence of terrestrial wildlife at these sites. We just started deploying these sensors this year, so we don't really have a whole lot of data to share or to analyze. But here's a few examples. Here's an American kestrel flying over one of the sites, recorded from one of our cameras just earlier this year. Here's an animated shot of a Canadian goose coming up and saying hello to one of our cameras at a solar site this year. Let's see what else. Oh, and here's one of the recorders recording at one of our solar sites, picking up quite a few birds singing in the background. Sounds like, there's a red-winged blackbird, robin, and song sparrow in there. And yeah, so just, a variety of other types of approaches that we're utilizing this year to all answer the question of, do these solar sites co-located with habitat enhancement, do they benefit biodiversity? What are the responses of biodiversity to these solar sites? All in the attempts to help inform future guidelines, future decisions on the effectiveness of solar pollinator habitat. So that is all I had to share today. Let's see, it's 2:38. Hopefully there's time for questions. I apologize, I was not monitoring the chat, but I am certainly happy to go back on any one of these slides to reiterate some things, or if there are any questions. Let me see, I'm looking at the chat. It looks like, yeah, there's a lot.
Yeah, we did get a couple of questions in the chat box going, and since we only have 17 people online right now, I'd like to go ahead and open them up to the people that were asking questions. Laura, you had a question. Why don't we go ahead and start with you?
Yeah, hi. It's probably out of the scope of this particular presentation, but I feel like it's important that we're having this discussion at the same time about, we've lost millions of acres of ag land and development over the last couple of decades. And there is this sort of like almost, I feel like messaging of like, if we just put it on disturbed lands, we can potentially meet our federal renewable energy goals. But I just think that we need to also include in this messaging about, what that means, what that conversion means, even if it is to pollinator habitat. But what does that mean to the U.S. ag production, and what does that mean for lands that may have been under farm bill programs? But my question was like, how do we rectify? How do we make that balance? And it's quite philosophical, but it's something I grapple with quite a bit. It's like, how do we meet our renewable energy goals and fight climate change, but also not potentially have a negative influence on other aspects of our culture and our economy at the same time. So it's probably really out of the scope, but of what you're,
No, it's really not. It really fits in with the big picture of, of what we're dealing with. We've got a land use issue, and part of that issue is how can we conserve prime farmland to also meet our food needs and everything, you know. And there was recently a DOE funding announcement that was just recently. Well, it didn't end, but one of the due dates was yesterday, and that funding announcement was specifically targeted towards, I think, what you were describing, on how can we better co-locate solar in agricultural communities, and how can we benefit, or how can DOE show this alignment between solar and ag. And so I think what's going to happen is, out of this FOA, there's going to be a lot of good partnerships coming out of this, the partnerships between solar and agricultural communities that you know, have their best interests in mind, that is going to and I think that's going to really, you know, and move the needle on what you were talking about you know, making sure that you know, we're keeping prime farmland in prime farmland production. And I think agrivoltaics, any kind of agrivoltaic design, if it's properly sited in some area that's, you know, previously disturbed, it has the potential to also benefit you know, these agricultural communities and you know, adjacent farmland. But yeah, I don't one of the common things that we hear is that solar is taking away prime farmland. I personally don't want that. If it's marginal farmland, that's one thing. But you know, I agree. We with 10 million acres at stake on the horizon, we really should be focusing on our efforts on places that are more disturbed. And I think you know, there's a lot that can be done to maximize those co-benefits of solar energy and agricultural production.
Thank you for your answer.
Yeah, thank you, Lee. Amy, you had a question?
Yeah, my question related to the type of solar fields these are these fixed tilt or are they tracking?
2 of them are trackers,
Okay.
and 1 of them is fixed tilt. Yeah.
Okay.
So the three in Minnesota, that's their breakdown. I think all the other ones that we're currently looking at throughout the other states, pretty sure they're all trackers as well. So pretty much everything is tracking except for 1 fixed tilt in Minnesota.
Just a quick follow-up. Have you had any issues with the height of the plantings? We've had some challenges down here with the heights of the plantings getting in and causing shading issues on the panels, and also getting into the motors. And so our guys have been a little less, especially when we had one that got into a motor and caused a fire, little less thrilled about talking about pollinators then.
Yeah. That's really one of the big considerations when it comes to solar pollinator habitat, because you're obviously allowing vegetation to get to at least some height, and it's not being mowed constantly, kind of kept at that low state. And so you know, shading is an issue. You don't want the plants to get too tall to shade the panels and reduce efficiency, but you also want them to provide some sort of value. And so it depends on when these discussions are happening. If these discussions are happening early enough in the process, like before construction, developers might spend a little bit more money on their steel pylons to raise the panels up a little bit. And so what we've typically have, and this is just a ballpark, there's always variations to this, but what we've sort of ballparked when we talk to developers and talk to others is that if you can get these panels up 30 inches, maybe 3 feet off the ground, that's you can plant a good variety of seed mixes under there that can still be maintained at 3 feet or less to meet that. But as you saw in some of these other examples, there are some solar companies that, you know, each solar company kind of takes a slightly different approach. Some of them are a little bit more hands-on, some of them are a little bit more hands-off, and they're okay with things getting a little bit taller. This image here, there's probably some things here that are greater than 3 feet tall. But then again, that all goes back to, you know, how high off the ground are these panels and stuff. So yeah, that is definitely a consideration. I would say that no matter how high the panels are, whether they're touching the ground almost, or whether they're 3 feet off the ground, we've been able to come up with some type of seed mix that could work for that area and has been planted. But yeah, it's definitely a consideration. Yep.
Yeah, great discussion. Great discussion. Nicole had a question that I actually was curious about as well. Nicole, you want to ask it?
Sure, yeah, thank you. I'm curious about the management that's planned for these sites. It sounds like the Minnesota ones in particular are maybe still within the first few years of being established, but what are the plans for maintaining those sites over time, making sure that you don't have some cottonwoods springing up?
Yep.
And here in Minnesota, we like to typically burn hay or graze, and those don't seem like super viable options. I've heard the idea of goats being tossed around,
Yep.
but fear that goats are gonna maybe chew through a little bit too much. So yeah, what can you tell me a little bit more just about the
Really
management
good
aspect?
question. Yeah, really good question. Another one that's probably the second most important question to panel height and the restrictions that come with panel height is vegetation management following planting. Sort of, and this again, this varies by site to site, so it's not really a solid answer for all of them. But for the most part, what we're seeing is about two mows per year in the first few years. So after planting, they'll go in and mow at least 2 times per year for the first couple of years to kind of cut down on these, you know, undesirables and cottonwoods. So I don't know if this image shows it, but there are cottonwoods springing up in some of these sites, you know, and so they'll come in and mow, and they'll do selective removal of the cottonwoods, for example. They'll come in and they'll do selective removal. Following that, the plan is after, say, the 3rd year, they'll reduce things down to a 1 mow per year. They come in at the end of the season and mow like in August or something like that. And then some of the sites, I should have an image that I'm going to make another note to add an image of this. Some of the sites have started to introduce sheep. So livestock grazing is a part of this, and they've started to bring in sheep. I don't know how those partnerships come about, but there's a sheep farmer somewhere in the area, and they got connected with the solar companies, and you know, now the solar company is using free vegetation management in means of sheep grazing to control these sites. And I will say that where sheep are present, and I'm imagining it's probably the same as goats, but where these livestock are present, things are mowed down to the ground. Like there's nothing remaining. It's not to say that they're dead. It's not to say that the vegetation is dead. It's just that they do a very good job of clearing the vegetation. And so they rope off, or at least in the experiences that we've had, they've roped off some of these areas to kind of keep the sheep in these areas and outside of our transects. So we were able to tell them, like, hey, we've got pollinator transects over here in this area. If you're going to bring sheep in, keep them over here, you know. And so they've been able to do that. But when we get on site and we look over there, they're highly effective. And so sheep grazing is definitely done at some of these sites. Goats, I've heard of companies talk about goats, but for the reasons that you just explained, they like to chew on more things than just grass. I think
And they
sheep
like to climb.
and they like to climb. Yes. Yes. And so people have said, well, we don't want goats jumping on our panels. We don't want goats chewing on things. So I personally have never seen goats at any solar site. I have seen a lot of sheep. I think they're just a little bit more friendly. You know, they don't do as much harm. But yeah, so the future will tell, you know, kind of tell us on, you know, if there are future, infrastructural designs that are, you know, can accommodate goats. With part of this DOE funding announcement that I just mentioned, I think there might be some research proposals looking at cattle, like co-locating panels with cattle, which, you know, cattle are even more dangerous and more destructive than goats. And so it's going to require way more infrastructure and steel and reinforcements to, you know, co-locate these solar panels with cattle. But is it feasible? I think there's going to be some research that proposes that. So we're just now starting, you know, to understand, you know, what kinds of livestock is compatible with solar. I think sheep is. But even sheep, they do like I said, they do a very good job of clearing vegetation. But you know, within 1 year, we went back the following year, and within 1 year, the areas that the sheep had grazed, you would not have known that the sheep were there. I mean, I guess if you were to find some scat, you would notice. But you know, they've for all intents and purposes, we've hardly seen any effect in terms of plant diversity from the presence of sheep. But yeah, very good question.
Yeah, I just dropped a YouTube video in there. I've seen sheep being used recently to graze CRP.
Mhm.
One little thing, if I can add on, just as an aside to the mowing. I'm with Minnesota DNR, and we have a manager who swears now that it was a government shutdown back in 2011, I believe, that prevented him from getting in and mowing a site when he first was establishing it. And it was an accidental experiment. That site turned out to be one of his most forb diverse sites that he's ever, restored. And so he swears by that technique now, not actually going in and mowing and letting it sit for the first year or two before he actually goes in. So just some food for thought. It's a sample size of one, but a lot of our managers are doing that now, and they seem to get better forb diversity in those reconstructed prairies than if they go in and mow them right away.
Yeah, that's a great point. Yeah. I don't know how frequently the other sites are being mowed. So we have nine sites. I'm not sure the frequency of those other sites. They were just planted just last year. But the general MO is that compared to other forms of vegetation management, these pollinator sites are more hands-off, maybe a mow or two per year, but that's really about it. Whereas some of these other sites that are your conventional turfgrass sites, they might get mowed once a month, maybe more frequently than once a month, Yeah.
Lee, I kind of had a follow-up question to that. Through time, are you guys expecting to see a change in the vegetative composition of these sites? And is there going to be a need to go back in and reseed with those early forb type species? Especially with if you introduce grazing or mowing or anything like that to the situation, how are people talking about handling that through time?
Yeah, that's another really good question. So we have seen changes in plant communities over just in the first 4 years. And part of that was expected. So in the first couple years, we expected to see sort of a boom in black-eyed Susans, just because that's what black-eyed Susans do. We expected to see a boom and then sort of a trickling off. And that's exactly what we're seeing. So this photo was taken, I think, in 2019, 1 year after planting. We saw a bunch of black-eyed Susans. Now we're seeing things like this where there's hardly any black-eyed Susans. They're still there. We still see them, but they're not the dominant flowering plant anymore. This has got a lot of yarrow and golden Alexander. You can see some penstemon in here. And so this is kind of where things are sitting at now in 2022. So yeah, we have seen changes over time, kind of going in that trend from, one plant species, one dominant plant species gives way to the next. And so seeding in these kinds of situations, not generally a thought yet, I don't think, but in these kinds of situations where we might have several rows where for whatever reason, something didn't establish, there have been thoughts and have been considerations to go back in and reseed. So far as I know, there hasn't been any reseeding yet. I think they're still waiting to see what time tells us a little bit. And I should say that even within these rows, this is just one snapshot in time. I think this was taken early in the season, like maybe in early July. There are still flowering plants, native flowering plants in here that you just can't see. They're not blooming right now. And so, at a different time in the year, this same transect might show something else, a lot of goldenrod, for example. All of these sites have just a lot of goldenrod. And so for that reason, I think the land managers, the vegetation company here, Minnesota Native Landscapes, they've talked about reseeding, but they haven't quite done it yet. I think they're still kind of waiting for a few more years to kind of see what time will tell. But it's a good question.
Great, thank you. Michael Barfield, you had a question? Michael, are you on? Michael Barfield? You're still on mute. He might have stepped away, so I'll ask his question for him. He said, I am curious why there has not been a move to put solar on every roof. This saves land and represents a very large area that is readily available. It's kind of a good question. I know there's been a lot of discussion about rooftop solar in metropolitan areas. So what is your perspective, Lee, on that?
My perspective is I totally 100% agree. I think it gets super complicated though when you've got different landowners, different private entities, all sort of, all co-located there together. It's a lot simpler when you have just one big landowner that's leasing their land to a utility company. That's a lot simpler. So that's, I think, why we're all here. But I totally agree. Rooftop solar, I think, is certainly the way to go, especially in the built environment in urban areas. If you think of all the parking garages that we have, some of these huge Costco's and Walmarts and all these other industrial centers, rooftop needs to be there. Yeah, but I can't really say too much about the logistics or the politics or the hows and the whys about it.
Yeah, there's definitely a lot of that for sure.
Yeah.
I'm not seeing any more questions in the chat. Does anybody else have a question they'd like to ask? We've got a few more minutes. Just unmute yourself and go ahead and ask. Okay,
guess
well, go ahead. Yes, please.
Sorry, I just was a little slow on the unmuting. I just wanted to know what your feelings are on scaling this. These are some sort of small installations, I would say, I guess, given the needs, and just what are your thoughts or feelings about doing this in a larger scale situation?
Yeah. So we currently have several solar sites that are in the order of 100 to 200 megawatts in size. And that's a significantly more, a larger amount of land per solar site. We're talking like 800 acres for some of these sites, 1,000 acres for some of these sites. And one of the questions that we're trying to address to this is, can we get the same beneficial pollinator outcomes by planting at a subset of these sites, maybe again just around the periphery of the fenced area, and maybe not dedicating a highly diverse pollinator seed mix down the rows, maybe keep that a little bit more general, and then focusing the majority of the efforts around the perimeter. Because even if you just focus on those buffer areas around the perimeter of a 1,000 acre facility, that's still a lot of land that you're putting into habitat. So we're investigating that now. I do think that we'll still see some beneficial outcomes. Part of our design is running transects down within the same solar facility, running transects down some of the arrays that have a less diverse seed mix, and then running arrays are running our transects down areas that have a higher diversity pollinator seed mix, where it has taller plants, for example, more diverse plants, and we'll see if there are differences in pollinator communities there. So I think time will tell on that. I think that's one of the things that'll be addressed in some of the studies to come. But still a very good question.
Great. Well, thank you, Lee. I want to really thank you for taking the time to pull this together this month.
Yeah, my
Fascinating
pleasure.
presentation. And we are going to hopefully get to a point we post these recordings on our website. So those will be accessible. If you've missed our previous webinars, hopefully you'll be able to access them there. Next month's webinar, we haven't figured out the date exactly yet, but it's going to be the last full week of July, which is July 25th. I'm actually scheduled to give that webinar, and I'll be discussing something called bioeconomy development opportunity zones, which is a combination of President Trump's economic opportunity zone program in areas that have excess biomass potential, and how we are trying to create opportunities for rural landowners in those areas. So we'll be discussing that the week of the 25th. If anybody on here is interested in giving a webinar, please, please, please get in touch with us at the Renewable Energy Working Group, or send me an email personally. And I would be happy to schedule you for a webinar. One more reminder, I think next week on the 30th, if I recall, let me double check before I say something stupid. Let's see, Yes, the 30th at 2 p.m. Central Time, 3 p.m. Eastern. We actually have our Renewable Energy Working Group members meeting. So please be sure to attend that if you're available. It's a great time to get caught up. We have quarterly members meetings on what's happening within the working group. So with that, I will end the recording. Again, thank you all for joining us today.
And I
We
just
really-
wanted to mention, Susan, one last thing. My contact information is here on the title slide. I also put it in the chat in case anybody has any questions or would like to discuss pollinators and solar. I'd be happy to chat. So just wanted to plug that in there. Sorry, Susan.
Oh, no problem at all, Lee. So thank you again, and feel free to reach out to us if you guys have any questions or comments. All right, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.